Quick recap of what we did yesterday. Remember I handed you guys those little bagged sets of little artwork prints, and I asked you guys at the end of the hour to work with the groups at your tables and to sort them. In the little bags were a bunch of different artworks, some pretty well known and pretty common, and some a little bit less known. But you had to sort the artworks according to the little labels that were in the bags. Okay, and the labels were formal, informal, pure symmetry, approximate symmetry, inverted symmetry, radial symmetry, and asymmetry. Okay, and we did that. Do you remember why? What was the goal of doing that? I'll give you a hint. Was it because we've already learned all these things already? It's a pre-assessment, right? Okay. So yeah, it's just a longer word, and it sounds less scary than the word test. So the idea was we haven't learned that yet, at least not on any sort of official or together basis. But I wanted to see, could you tell the difference between them? Did you know any of those words? Were you able to match up any of the artworks with the words? Or were you just guessing? And if you were just guessing, how good and how close were your guesses, right? So just out of curiosity, how many of you felt like you knew nothing at all? How many of you felt like it was 100% guessing? Okay, good. How many of you felt like you knew maybe a few, but it was mostly guessing? Good. Anybody feel like you knew almost everything or majority of them? Okay, good. Then nobody will be bored as we learn this week or next week. So what we're going to go through today is we're going to go through the different types of visual balance, which were all of the little labels that you saw in the little packets. And we're going to show you examples and explain what each one means and how to identify them. And then that way, not only will you be able to sort those artworks in the little baggie again, but you'll also be able to see those different types of balance then in other artworks that exist, whether they're historical artworks or more current contemporary artworks, or you'll be able to, more importantly, identify those types of balance and implement and use those types of balance in your own artwork, okay? Because the idea here is that when you have an artwork that is balanced, that tends to be more aesthetically pleasing. It tends to have a little bit higher kind of visual value. In very, general terms, it's what we would, stereotypically consider to be better artwork. Okay, does that make sense? So by helping you become better visual balancers, you will develop your skills as a visual artist. So we've said visual balance now quite a few times, several times. Does anybody know, when we say visual balance, what are we really referring to? Any idea? When you look at an artwork, how can you tell if something is visually balanced or not?
Symmetry.
Symmetry is going to be a big part of it, okay? Symmetry is not the whole way to balance something, but it can be a big part of it. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, so like back to like the butterfly symbol, butterfly picture from yesterday. Visually balanced, I guess, like we mean that both sides look really identical.
Okay, so Elisa talked about symmetry, Luke talked about like the butterfly example and the both sides being identical. The cool thing about balance is that it can be more than just identical matching from side to side or symmetry. Okay, so symmetry, we're going to talk about. Symmetry is when something is the same on both sides. The example that I use is like when you take your hands like this and you open them, right? Your hands, unless you have, some sort of like deformity or something, are usually approximately the same on both sides, right? Now if you have like a paper cut or if you have a callus or a hangnail or something on one side, that's going to change things up a little bit. But in general, your hands would be the same on both sides. If you think back to like elementary school, when you folded that pink piece of paper in half, you cut half a heart in the month of February, and then you open it and you have a symmetrical heart, okay? Or if you did it in October with an orange piece of paper, you'd have a symmetrical pumpkin. Or if you did it in December with a green piece of paper, you have a symmetrical pine tree, right? So the idea here is that symmetry means something is the same on both sides. Would you agree that if something was the same on both sides, it would be visually balanced? Would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah, it would be, okay? Would you also agree that there are other ways to balance something besides having it be exactly the same on both sides? There are. So we're going to use a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a scientific example, but we're going to use some scientific flavor here to help our explanations a little bit. I want you to think of a seesaw. Okay, you've all used a seesaw or have seen a seesaw at some point in your life. You understand how a seesaw works, yes? Okay. I want you to think of a seesaw, and I want you to think of a giant on one side of the seesaw. Okay? Now, we said that we could balance something out by making it the same on the other side, yes? So we could find an identical twin giant for the other side, and we would have a giant on each side, and that would be balanced, correct? Yes? Okay, good. But what if, this giant did not have a twin, because I don't know any giants that have twins. I don't know any giants, period. So what if we had to balance it in some other non-identical way? What could we do to put on the other side of that seesaw to balance out the giant on one side? What do you think?
I don't know, instead of building.
Put a building on the other side? That could work. Depends on how big our giant is, right? What if all we had were like average size humans in our immediate area? What could we do with those average size humans to balance out the one giant on the other side? Put a bunch of them, right? So we've got a giant on one side, we've got several average size humans on the other side. Weight-wise, right, eventually we could get to a point where that would theoretically balance, yes? Okay? Visually, in your artworks, visual balance works very similarly to physical balance, like the example I just gave you, okay? So, hold that thought. Julian, you are going to O'Connell for ELT, Miriam to Lemke, Isaiah, you're here, Cass, you're here, Gavin, you're here, Kirsten to Tingo, and Tana to Ortiz. Thank you. I lost my train of thought about the giants. So visual balance and physical balance are actually quite a bit more similar than you might realize, okay? So instead of a giant this time, let's say we have a shape. Let's say we have a really big shape on this side of our scale. Give me a really big shape. An anvil. That's pretty complicated. I'm going to simplify. It's going to look like this. Okay? There's a really big shape. I don't have another anvil shape for this side. What could I use? What could I add to balance that out?
Boulder.
A boulder. Okay? So I could have something that is relatively the same size. Does that look approximately visually balanced? Like there is an equal distribution of visual weight? More or less, right? What if I didn't have any, just trapped my eraser. What if I didn't have any big shapes? I realize that's a silly example because I can draw whatever I want, right? But what if I didn't want it to be exactly matching, but I still wanted it to feel balanced? What could I put there to balance out this big anvil?
Small anvils.
Small anvils, right? Is that balanced yet? Not really, right? And so that feeling that you guys are getting right now when you look at this and you're like, it doesn't really feel balanced yet. That is the key component here to visual balance. It's a lot of kind of looking at it and getting a general feeling of how does that look? Does it look balanced? Does it still kind of look like it's missing something? Sometimes it's hard for us to describe that feeling when we see something and we're like, it doesn't feel quite balanced yet. And that's what this project is about. Giving you the vocabulary to be able to explain that, but also helping you develop that sense of what do you feel when you look at it? Does it feel like it is balanced? Does it feel like it maybe needs something else or it's too open yet? Okay? Several of you guys identified that in your perspective projects, right? So you had maybe a very open ceiling space and you kind of felt like, I need to put a little more something up there. Or maybe you had a really open wall space or floor space or whatever. You start to get that feeling like too much negative space maybe needs to have more stuff in it. Okay? And as we go through this unit, we're going to give you some more specifics about what are some technical ways that we could balance out different things. So we're going to talk about things like complexity, balancing out simple shapes with complex ones, things like size, like this example, okay, so balancing out a big shape with smaller ones. We're going to talk about things like color and different ways to manipulate color, okay. So that's kind of the heart of this project, is being able to identify those imbalances, but then once you do, figuring out what you can do as an artist and a designer to bring it back into balance so that you have a complete work. Okay, so here are the types of balance that we talked about in the packets yesterday, okay? And notice how I have them grouped. Yesterday I gave you kind of no guidance on that. I shuffled them up in a bag and I said, here you go, take a guess, figure it out, right? So how we would break that down, if this was kind of like a flow chart or a more organized chart, would be kind of two columns. Oops. So we're going to say we have two types of balance. We have formal and informal, okay? And then as kind of subcategories of formal balance, we have symmetry, okay? So when we talk about formal balance, we're always talking about some form of symmetry. Does that make sense? Guys, pick your heads up. It's going to be a lot easier for you to stay awake and pay attention if you sit up. So there are 4 different types of symmetry that we're going to look at. Pure symmetry is going to be where something is exactly the same on both sides. Okay? Approximate symmetry is kind of like it sounds, where it's mostly the same. It's approximately the same. Inverted symmetry means one side is what? Anybody know? What does inverted mean? William?
Basically, like, from up, there's like, basically a playing card, right?
You can think of a playing card, yes?
Kind of like that.
Yep. We'll talk about that. In fact, that's one of our examples. Anybody a big fan of roller coasters? You guys know what an inversion is on a roller coaster? What direction do you go if you go through an inversion? You go upside down. Okay, so upside down is our key for inversion or inverted symmetry. We'll talk about that. With inverted symmetry, one side is upside down. And then radial symmetry means that it goes around symmetrically in a circle. Yep, I gave you a big clue there when I said around. So we're going to give you examples of those, okay? But you should know that all symmetry is formal balance, or we could say that it's formally balanced when we talk about visual balance, okay? Now, there's this like little lonely side over here, right? The screen is not very balanced. There's all these types of formal balance. There's like one kind of informal balance, and that is asymmetry. Now, when we talk about balance, there's multiple ways here on across our chart that we can use to balance an artwork, or that artists use to balance artworks. But I'm going to tell you that despite the fact that there looks like a lot more options on this side, most artwork is actually informally balanced and is asymmetrical. Okay, so this one I would say gets used a heck of a lot more than these. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, if you are a visual person, which we all are to some degree, right? You could draw this graphically as well, right? So you could have your formal symmetry, and you would have pure, inverted, radial, approximate, right? And then your informal symmetry would be asymmetry. There would only be one on that one. Is that making sense? How those kind of line up? Okay, so these are probably kind of the simplest examples that I can give you at this point. So pure symmetry, do this so we can draw the axes. Pure symmetry would be if we folded this heart in half on this vertical axis, okay, each side would be exactly the same. True? Okay, so that's purely symmetrical. But when we do this, it is not the same. Why is this still hanging out on the pure symmetry slide? Because the axis has to be horizontal, exactly. So when we're talking about symmetry, we're not just talking about vertically symmetrical, but it can be horizontally symmetrical as well. Does that make sense? More or less? Okay, good. Okay, here are some examples of approximate symmetry. So if we draw our vertical axis, okay, see how it's not exactly the same on both sides? If we folded that, it wouldn't exactly match up. But just from a visual standpoint, when you just look at it, it's approximately the same on both sides, right? Okay. This one is also sort of an example of inverted symmetry. So we'll come back to that one as well. This one as well, you could really use either axis, right? It's going to be approximately the same on both sides. It's not exact, but it's like close enough, right? So does approximate symmetry make sense? Okay. To go back to the hand example, okay, if we had our hands like this, put your hands like this, and we opened them up, I would be okay with saying that your hands are purely symmetrical. It's close enough for me. But if you wanted to argue that they are approximately symmetrical because your skin wrinkles are a little different on one side than the other, or you broke a fingernail on one side and that doesn't match, I would be okay with saying that it is approximately symmetrical as well. Okay, that's kind of a judgment call. I'm not super scientific about it to mandate so specifically. Okay, now we're going to talk about inverted symmetry, and that's where we talked about where things are upside down. Julian used the example of the playing card. So if you think about like Jack of Spades, the King of Hearts, whatever, one person, one face on that card is upright, and the other one is upside down. So that's inverted symmetry.
There's also a suicide king that
What does that mean?
being like he can see the king, like he doesn't have his sword or axe just kind of sticking out. He has it like in his head.
Oh, I get what you're saying, where it like overlaps.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, and that's an inverted symmetry also. So if we take our axis here and we follow it down, okay, if we folded this in half over that axis, it would be the same on both sides if one side was flipped. Okay? So going back to the hand example, put your hands up again. Open them up like this. Now if you take one and flip it upside down, you got to do like some weird like arm yoga to get it to line up right. But the idea there is that it's still the same over that fold, but one side is upside down. Okay? So if we folded that, it would be symmetrical top to bottom, which is overcomplicating, but the idea is still the same. Does that make sense how this works? Okay? Now, these are technically two different shapes, so it's a little bit easier to see. This one is all one connected shape, okay? And obviously, right, we said these are oversimplified. Not all art is like super well defined and clear like this is. But if we folded this, okay, would that be the same on both sides as it currently stands? No. But if we flipped one of these halves upside down, then it would be. Does that make sense? Okay, so hopefully this helps you remember, and then you can look like you're like doing like some hip hop dance or something. Any questions on inverted symmetry? Okay, one caveat, just because something is upside down doesn't mean that it's actually inverted symmetry. Keep that in mind. It's easy to fall into that trap. Okay, here's another one that has a trap with it as well. So radial symmetry means that as we go around a circle, right? What is a radius, by the way? The root word of radial symmetry. Yep.
I mean, it's kind of like half what it is.
It's kind of like half a circle, but how can we specify the radius of a circle? Radius goes from where to where on the circle? You remember? Geometry.
Is it the middle of the circle?
From the middle of the circle to
The other side?
the edge, yes. So you can have radii, right? Now I know math teacher, but you can have radii that go all the way around the circle. That's the core of radial symmetry right there. Okay? So it's not just that we're folding it in that axis, it's not just that we're folding it in this axis, but you can really have any axis at any angle around the circle, theoretically, generally speaking, and you will have symmetry that reflects and repeats in all directions all the way around. Does that make sense? So it's not just fold it and upside down, but it's actually all the way around. Okay? So both of these are radially symmetrical. Okay? I like this example because it doesn't really look like a circle. Okay? Because here's the caveat with this one. People tend to think that just because something has a circle, that it is radially symmetric. Don't fall into that trap. Okay? Big step over that one. So just because it's a circle does not necessarily mean that it is radially symmetrical. Make sense? Questions on radial symmetry? Just out of curiosity, we have 4 types of symmetry. Which one do you think is the most common? Pure, approximate, inverted, or radial? Which do you think is most commonly found in our work? Take a guess. You got a 1 out of 4 chance. Who thinks pure is the most common? Who thinks approximate? Good. Who thinks inverted? Who thinks radial? Good. Most of you guessed approximate, and you are correct. Okay, approximate is, of the symmetries, is the most common. Okay? Of all the types of balance, what is actually more common? Asymmetry. Okay? So asymmetry means that things are still balanced, things are still visually balanced, the weight of that visual is distributed evenly, okay? But it doesn't follow that same on both sides type of matching. Okay? So if we folded this, clearly it would not match up. Nothing about this would match up from side to side, but when you look at it, does it feel like the weight and the positive and negative space are distributed kind of evenly? Yeah, it does. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anybody know, and you guys are a perfect example of this right now, does anybody know why asymmetry tends to be more commonly used in art than any of the other types of symmetry? Why might an artist prefer to use asymmetry? Any guesses?
More abstract and more freedom.
Gives you more freedom as an artist. Yep. When, especially in ceramics, I always encourage my students, especially if you are the type that likes things to match from side to side, I encourage you to use asymmetrical design, because how hard is it to get something to match once you make it once? Right? Really, really hard. And oftentimes when we try to do that, it ends up being kind of disappointing, because the second one inevitably will not really match the first one, because we're humans, right? That's like normal. So it tends to be a little bit less pressure, and like she said, a little bit more freedom on the artist to be able to design asymmetrically, because then you can change your mind on the second half and it won't matter because it doesn't have to match. Why else might artists prefer asymmetry? Or maybe I should ask it this way. Why might viewers of art prefer asymmetry?
Because it's more interesting to look at.
It's more interesting to look at, okay? Now that's not always the case. I'm making kind of a gross generalization right now. But asymmetry tends to be more interesting to look at, right? Look at you all right now. You're like half asleep, your heads are down, your eyes may or may not be open. Why? Because I'm talking kind of the same the whole time, right? When something is the same for a period of time, you tune out. It gets boring. You assume that what's happening now is the same as or going to be the same as what you've already heard or seen. So your brain is like, not wasting time on that, right? When we look at something that's asymmetrical, we have to pay more attention to it. Because we can't make that assumption. Our brain can't say, well, I already saw the first half, so I know what the second half is going to look like. You can't make that assumption because the second half's totally different. So your brain has to pay more attention. Your brain has to do more focusing and more analysis and evaluating of what it's actually seeing because it's different. So that tends to keep your viewers more engaged. It tends to make their experience of viewing the artwork a little bit more interesting. Asymmetrical art, I would say, I don't know, I don't have like any scientific backing to back me up on this fact, but I would venture a theory that asymmetrical art is also easier to remember for viewers because of how your brain has to work to process it because it's so different. Does that make sense? Does asymmetry make sense? Okay, awesome. What we're going to do is, let me ask you this. Do you want me to give you the artwork in the baggies back to regroup now that you know what's up, or do you want to just jump into the examples and we'll go through it all together? Pick one or the other.
Examples.
You want us to do all together, or do you want to do it in groups?
Together.
Together? You guys cool with that? Okay. You need to stand up and like shake yourselves out while I switch PowerPoints. Do some stretching. Touch your toes.
Cut your toes.
Don't cut your toes. For as much as it is raining outside, it is so dry in here today.
I figured it would be out long.
Has it felt like it's been a long day? I know it can't help that I'm sitting up here talking to you guys at the end of the day. I don't mind if you need to stand up while we're talking. That's totally fine with me. I won't be offended. I feel better about that than if you fall asleep on me. Okay, so let's go through. We're going to go through example by example. You're going to tell me what type of symmetry you think it is, and then I'm going to say why, and then you're going to tell me that, and then we're going to move on. Fair enough? Ready? Okay. Boolean.
Inverted.
Inverted. Why?
Because it's flipped basically.
Because it's flipped?
Yep.
Okay. And I know that some of these examples in this PowerPoint are going to be sideways. You're going to have to like do the turning your head thing. It's for people who are asleep, right? So yes, you are correct. It is inverted. So if we flipped, we would have to also do the upside down thing in order to find that symmetry. Yes, correct. How about the butterfly? I'm hearing pure. Anybody else have another theory on this one? Proximate. I would say both or either, depending on how you want to look at that, would be okay. I would say it's close enough that it's probably pure, but technically speaking, it's probably approximate. If I was like doing a written exam and testing you on this, which I'm not gonna, but if I was, I would take either answer. Okay, A+ for that. Christina's World, Andrew Wyeth. Asymmetry. Agree or disagree? Agree. Good. Now, what is working? This is a little bit harder question now. We're not in clip art land anymore. What is working to help balance the asymmetrical nature of this? Okay. So would you agree, first of all, that it is balanced, even though it's asymmetrical? Yes. Right. There is not another girl in a pink dress on the other side of this canvas. So what is balancing out this figure? The house. Yes, in the upper corner. So how come that little tiny house, I mean, look at this. The house is this big. That's like 1, 2, it's like a third, maybe, the size of her. Okay, that's a gross estimation, but the idea is the same. How does that little tiny house balance out this whole big figure? Not calling her fat, she's just bigger. Because why? Because it's in the distance, okay? Specifically, it's closer to the edge of our canvas, okay? And we're gonna talk about that tomorrow, about where you place things on the canvas actually can affect their visual weight. Just lean it against the cabinet over there, please. Thank you. Any other reasons why, besides the fact that it's placed up in the corner, why the house might be able to balance out her as a figure?
Has a lot of detail.
Has a lot of detail, yes. So there's not a ton of detail in her, okay? Her dress is like mostly the same or very similar pink color. There's a lot of little details in the house though, okay? So more detail is going to appear visually heavier. It's going to be able to balance out things that are bigger than it. Does that make sense? Okay. Something else that I want you to kind of start looking for. Her dress is warm tone, right? It's pinkish. She's surrounded by a bunch of other similar warm tones, pink, brown, kind of in the same wedge on the color wheel, right? The house up here is a really dark house surrounded by not only a lighter ground, but lighter sky. So that creates more contrast up towards the top. There's less contrast going on down here, okay? The way that you see contrast is if you squint. Since we're so tired, our eyes are already half squinty, right? So squint, you're gonna see that a lot of her body, especially like down here by her feet and by her head, kind of starts to blend in with the surroundings there, which makes her less visually dominant, less visually heavy. And when you squint at the house, it's still very clear sky, house, clear separation between the two. Does that make sense? Okay, so even if you don't understand like the exact details of why that all works, I want you to be able to at least start recognizing that and start looking for that as we go through examples. Okay, so, yep, do the whole head tilty thing. What type of symmetry? Not asymmetry, although I can totally see why you would guess that. It is approximate, yes. So there are some approximately symmetrical elements of this that are repeated. What do we see that's repeated from side to side? The house. The sky, yep. Trees in the background, right? There's some trees here. I love Grant Wood, like round green trees. What else is repeated? What? Shirts, yep. So the general tone of their clothing, right, pretty dark. We see a little bit of the white repeated right in the collar area. They're not exactly the same, but there's still a little bit of white on each one. Their head shapes, their skin tones, right? All those things are things that contribute to that feeling of approximate symmetry. Okay, the pitchfork, did you guys notice that one as well? It's not exactly on center, but it's centered-ish. Okay, good. Rose window, Notre Dame. Radial, yes. If you said pure, you're technically not wrong, because if you folded it in half, it would be exactly the same. But a better answer would probably be radial, because it's not just on one axis, but it's all the way around. Okay, so this is like probably like the most classic example of radial symmetry in all of art history. So that's a good one. Okay, one of my favorites, like I said yesterday, George O'Keeffe, Music, Pink and Blue, number 2.
Radio.
Not radial. Let's think this way. Is it symmetrical or not? And this is a sideways one too. It is not symmetrical. So what does that leave us? Asymmetry. Has to be asymmetry if it's not symmetrical. Okay? Is it balanced? Yes. Okay? When you squint at this, what tends to be the dominant thing that you see first? This right here? Okay? What balances this on this side? What balances that big dark blue area? This part? Mm,
Oh, down.
maybe. It might, because it has some curve that kind of follows. What else is going to balance this big dark blue area? Luke.
Shade.
The shade. Tell me more about the shade.
So yeah, like the part up there is pretty dark, and the part down there is pretty dark.
Yeah. So we see a lot of darkness here. That's pretty dominant. We also see very much more subtly that this kind of fades to darkness as it goes towards the edge. Remember what we said about things on the edge? They carry more visual weight than things in the middle. So even though the shade down here is less, it's more subtle, it does carry more visual weight than what's towards the center because it's on the edge. Okay? So this little bit of darkness that it kind of fades on the edge is going to balance out that whole big dark area. Isn't that cool? This is like one of the coolest concepts that I think we can use in art. Just the ability to kind of control things like that visually. Okay? So is that starting to make sense? Okay? Another sideways one. Chrysler Building, New York. There's a couple of potential answers for this one. It's going to depend on how you explain it. What do you think? You say approximate. Why?
Because like, well, I mean like, yeah, if you were to kind of like angle, I mean if you were to kind of like move the camera direction like it was 3D mount,
Yep.
just kind of like move it over just a little bit, then it would be pure symmetry. But no, it's like looking at it, so it's at the corner. You
Mhm.
see 3 corners of the building.
Nailed it. So he says if we were looking, if the camera was moved a little bit, it was looking at the building straight on, this would be pure symmetry. And that's correct. If we're looking just at the building, right? If we take the picture just as it is at face value, this would be approximate because we do see one side of the building but not the other on the other side. So that has to be approximate symmetry. I've also had people say if you take the background of this picture into account, oops, it is similar from side to side, but it is not exactly the same. Okay, so it just depends on how you want to define what you're looking at. Okay, last one for today. This is the oldest art that art history recognizes from 15,000 BC. Very, very, very old. What type of balance does this use that they even had 17,000 years ago? Approximate. Why?
Because there's bulbs on each side.
There's similar things on each side. They are even a mirror image of each other, approximately, right? But we know that it's not exactly the same. Is this starting to make sense? Okay, good. We will go through the rest of these on Monday, and then we'll jump into the specifics of why those balances happen the way they do and how we can control them and manipulate them as artists. Good job today.